Yeah, so my name is Lefumai Kalepo. I am a PhD student, third year in sustainability. I am going to talk about some work I've been doing research-wise in sub-Saharan Africa. This relates to electrification and basically accelerating electricity access in rural sub-Saharan Africa. So this picture that you see here is of an elder woman in a remote rural village in Lesotho. And she's so delighted. She has just received a connection from a mini grid, basically. So this is the first time she receives electricity connection. And this is a school in the same village. These students are so excited because maybe all of a sudden their study experience is going to change. So basically, we can all agree that electricity has a way of changing people's lives, whether it's educationally, whether it's at home, or healthcare, and many other applications where it can be put to use. And when you look at the trend of basically connecting people with electricity worldwide, it seems we are doing a pretty great job because it seems like the number of people, like a percentage of people without access, is shrinking every passing year, while access is actually getting more and more. But is it so? Well, partly yes and partly no. It seems as much as we are getting more and more people connected, it is not in an equitable way. In some parts of the world, it's probably getting worse, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. This figure here shows the electricity access rate at the end of 2019. And as we can see, majority of African countries are actually below 50% access rate. And majority of the people who actually don't have access in these countries live in remote rural areas. And I thought this one was the most interesting one. As more and more people worldwide are getting access, and other continents are actually not closing down on the 100% access rate, we see that in sub-Saharan Africa, actually the number of people without access is actually growing as time goes on. So the big question is, especially with goals like SDG 7 in mind, how do we close this gap? How do we connect these people who are currently unconnected? And a lot of research has actually been done focusing on this specific problem. And the consensus within the research fraternity is that to close this gap, we probably have to look into two complementary tracks of electrification. This is grid extension, and these are decentralized off-grid systems. And mainly because it is also widely accepted or agreed in studies that it may be easier to connect these rural communities using decentralized off-grid systems, simply because they are the most cost-effective way of giving these people access to electricity. And because of this problem, we got an inspiration from it, and we tried to at least write or study something towards actually solving this problem. And we have written a paper with my supervisor, Nathan Williams, and my co-supervisor, Jay Taneja, where we try to look at the financial barriers of accelerating electricity access to remote rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa. And in this paper, what we basically do is we evaluate the subsidy that is channeled towards grid extension, and we try to use that subsidy to make a case of whether or not decentralized off-grid systems would be a better electrification pathway for those communities. And we do this, we actually develop a special model to help us do this, and we apply this special model to Mombasa province in Kenya to actually test and determine whether or not Mombasa's electrification strategy or plan aligns with the goals of SDG 7. So, but why do subsidies matter? In as much as literature and research shows that it might be more cost-effective to electrify rural communities with decentralized off-grid systems, in most sub-Saharan African countries, the more prevalent way of extending electricity access is still through grid extension. And there are two reasons, or maybe one major reason why this is still the case. The major reason is the grid extension is mainly undertaken by public utilities, which receive a lot of subsidy funding, and the off-grid space is mainly privately operated and doesn't enjoy as much benefits in terms of subsidies that the grid extension counterparts actually receive. And because of this, we end up extending the grid to places where it really doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for two reasons. You find that it's too expensive to connect some of these communities. And even after expanding electricity to these communities, they don't consume as much electricity to actually justify the cost of connecting them. So basically the utilities don't ever stand a chance of ever making a profit, actually let alone break even connecting and providing electricity to remote, sparsely populated remote areas. So the research questions that we try to answer in this paper are, what is the implicit subsidy that goes towards providing grid electricity to rural customers? And then how do those subsidies actually compare to against subsidies that would be required for decentralized alternatives? And also, what are efficient ways of allocating this subsidy, considering mini-grids as a technological option to actually reach more customers? And we try to answer these questions at the special resolution of a community, and by a community in this case, we refer to a transformer community. A transformer community is a cluster of customers that are served by a single distribution transformer. And how do we characterize a subsidy? We characterize a subsidy as a positive difference between the net present value cost and the net present value revenue generated from a community over a certain period of time after receiving electricity access. And we use here a period of 30 years as our modeling horizon. And in these equations, so basically the cost component is composed of or consists of generation cost, transmission cost, distribution cost, and then operations and management cost. And on the revenue side, we have revenue from charging the customers connection fees, and also revenue from electricity consumption. And we discount our cash flows using a real interest rate on a monthly basis. So basically, the index K here would mean a month since the community received a connection. And to do this study, we use for on the grid side, we use geospatial grid network data, which includes HV transmission infrastructure, substations, medium voltage distribution infrastructure, distribution transformers locations, low voltage network infrastructure, and customers locations. We also need associated cost data and also consumption data. On the off-grid side, we also use some of the geospatial grid network data, specifically the low voltage network data, and also the customer's location. But on top of that, we need insolation data because the mini grids that we simulate here, hybrid solar PV, battery storage, and diesel generation mini grids. We also use consumption data and associated cost data with these pieces of infrastructure. What we assume here is that the consumption levels on the grid are the same as those on the off-grid side. And we also assume that the low voltage distribution network is the same for the grid and for the off-grid systems or the mini grids. This is a brief overview of the methods. Basically, we have customers, we have consumption, we have low voltage cost data and network data. We used all of this to evaluate the associated costs and the revenues. And then at the end, we use those to evaluate the subsidy. So the way in literature or even in real applications, the decision to extend the grid to a community or not to extend it is largely hinged on the cost of the medium voltage infrastructure that is needed to extend the electricity access to that community. And so what on the figure that we see here shows a typical medium voltage network with a substation S, and then 4 different communities A, B, C, and D. And these communities are also, they also have years of connections associated with them. So community A was connected in year 0 together with community B. And then community C was actually connected 2 years later, which is in year 2. And then community D was actually connected a year later, which was in year 1. So what is a fair way of allocating this infrastructure cost to these communities? Because clearly taking just a simple average will mask some of the special contributions or special differences that these communities bring. So we propose 2 cost MV infrastructure cost allocation methods. The first one is weighted average, which in the paper we just simply use as average method. And under this method, what we do is for any piece of shared infrastructure, we weigh the cost by the number of downstream customers that infrastructure serves. So basically, when you look at these nodes, you realize that from this node here to community B, this piece of infrastructure here is only going to be allocated towards customers in or towards community B. But then as you move upstream, these numbers keep adding up such that the infrastructure cost immediately from the substation is actually shared evenly among all the customers. The second method is the marginal method, which is actually what is used in real life when decisions are being made as to whether to extend the grid or not to extend the grid. They actually look at what is the cost of extending the medium voltage network from the closest point to that community. So here, because the community A and community B were connected in the same year, they will actually share this piece of infrastructure here. But then the rest of it, like for here, it will just be B because B was connected before D and C. And then at the end, you see that D has only the infrastructure that is immediate to it, whose cost is actually associated with it, and also C, because they were connected years later. These two cost allocation models have certain advantages and disadvantages, and can serve different purposes based on different sort of reasoning spectrum. So as a utility, when you try to plan for long-term planning, the marginal cost method sort of gives you an overview of what is going to be the average cost of connecting all individual different communities. But year by year, and especially with budget constraints, the marginal method is a better way of assessing whether or not projects are worth undertaking. So with this, okay, for the transmission cost and the low voltage network cost, we assume those are distributed evenly amongst the customers they serve. So that's why I didn't actually try to include the methods of computing that here, because they are just simple averages. So moving on to results, we evaluated the connection costs for all these core communities. We have about 129 communities that are in our service area, or in the data set that we use. And these two figures here show the distributions of the average cost of connection for different network components in these communities. And so basically on the x-axis is average per community, and on the y-axis is actually the fraction of the transformer communities that fall below or under that average. And we realize that the average of average of connection costs for the average method is actually lower than the average of the average under the marginal MV cost allocation. And we can see here that the medium voltage network actually constitutes more of the cost than the low voltage network, while the transmission network is actually just a constant because this is shared evenly amongst all of the customers. And we can see from the skew of these distributions that there are a few outlier communities which actually stretch the distribution. So basically they stretch the mean. So I think a more representative metric here would be the median, because the mean is actually stretched by those few outlier communities. And what we also do is also to plot the average subsidy over the 30-year time horizon. We plot this distribution, and we also realize that under the average MV cost allocation, the mean is actually lower than the mean for the marginal MV cost allocation. And similar to the infrastructure cost, we see here that there are a few outliers which are actually pulling the mean towards the right. So maybe the median is a more representative metric to actually make decisions based on. Here we examined on the left. These are figures corresponding to the average MV cost allocation method, and on the right figures associated with the marginal MV cost allocation method. And on the top left, what we are doing is we are investigating how basically how the community size and the dispersion and the allocated medium voltage length, how they affect the mean subsidy in those communities. And what we realize here is actually most communities, so the way we measure dispersion is we take customer points in a community and construct a minimum spending tree that covers all those customers and the transformer location. And we divide the length of that network by the number of customers in that community. So we realize, we see here that for most or majority of communities in our service area, the dispersion is actually under 100 meters per customer. And except a few communities, the medium length per customer is also, for most communities, less than maybe actually less than 100 meters per customer. And on the bottom, what we do, this figure that we see on the bottom left is a distribution of how the cost components actually contribute, and these are normalized. So basically, on the positive y-axis, we have the revenues, On the negative y-axis, we have the cost, and and on the x-axis we have individual transformer communities. So basically, each bar here represents a community in like one of the communities of the 129 communities, and they have been sorted in descending order of the subsidy. So we realized that there's a few communities within our service area from whom the utilities actually realize profits. I think these are about 2 or 3, and with the rest, they actually need subsidies. And we did this for both the marginal cost MV cost allocation and also for the average MV cost allocation models. There are some differences which are not easy to see on this graphs, but on these figures, but we will see them in the upcoming figures or analysis. So we also computed the subsidy that would be needed for off-grid or mini-grid connections in those communities. And we plotted the distribution of the subsidies for the mini-grids together with the one for the grid extension on the same plot to actually compare them. And we realized that for the off-grid, the average is actually low for both cases, but the median is actually higher. So the distribution for the mini grids is actually much tighter than it is for the for grid extension, and this makes sense because the grid extension costs, especially the medium voltage cost, is actually the one that is pulling or contributing more towards the the grid extension subsidy. So you can imagine that for the communities whose average connection per connection subsidy is very low, is because they are much closer to the feeder substation, while when you go further away from the substation, the costs rise significantly. Hence, the long tail distributions. So we used the subsidies for grid extension and off grid systems to actually compare or classify the communities into either falling within grid space or mini grid space. And the way we determine this is if for a community the subsidy required for grid extension is higher than the subsidy that is required for off-grid connection, then that community is in mini-grid space. And the reverse is also true. So if the mini-grid subsidy is higher than the grid extension subsidy, then that community falls within the grid space. So under the average medium voltage cost allocation method, we found out that out of the 129 communities, 77 actually fall within grid space, while 52 fall on the mini-grid space. And under the marginal method, we found out that 81 fall within the grid space, while 48 fall within the mini-grid space. So what we do next is we plot the the lost or the missed potential average saving per community. And the way we classify, we characterize this is for any community that has received grid extension but falls on the mini grid space, we take the difference of the the grid extension subsidy and the mini grid connection subsidy. So we call that a missed potential saving, and we plot the distributions of this missed potential savings as distributions, and we realize that under the average MV cost allocation method, utilities lose about $6,400 per customer over 30 years for connecting those customers with via grid extension, as opposed to giving them connections through mini grids. And we see that under the marginal MV approach, the utilities actually lose an average of $7,700 per customer. So using those values, we realized that so basically the communities that fall within mini grid space but ended up getting grid extension connection make up 40% in the under average method and made up 37% under the marginal MV cost allocation method, respectively. And we realized that not connecting those communities with grid, but with off-grid systems, the end result would be a 50% and 54% system-wide savings. And also we realized that because the average connection subsidy for the mini grids of 3,000 or almost 3,400, flipping over. So basically, instead of giving those communities electricity access by extending the grid, but instead giving them electricity access by decentralized off-grid systems, we could have used the money that has been potentially lost in savings. We could have used it to connect 97 more communities using the off-grid systems under the average cost allocation method, or we could have connected 109 more communities using under the marginal MV cost allocation method. And this would represent about 75% and 84% increase in rural electrification penetration, basically for the two MV cost allocation methods. And we took our analysis further to try to see how much energy would customers need to use in these communities for the utilities to actually break even at the discount rate that we are using. And we realized that under the average MV cost allocation method, the customers would have to use on average about 353 kilowatt hours per month. While under the marginal MV cost allocation method, the customers would need to use at least 365 kilowatt hours per month. Under the mini grid, the customers would have to use less than a third of what they would need to use for grid extension at about 97 kilowatt hours per month. But then, even with this, we like when you look at this figure here, the vertical line shade, like the blue dotted line, actually shows what is the actual mean consumption at the moment across all these customers, and this pales in comparison to what these customers actually need to use. So basically, there is no chance that this set of customers would dramatically or significantly increase their consumption levels to actually reach the levels that we see here under the current tariff level. So basically, the utilities almost stand no chance of ever realizing profits or even breaking even. We also determined what the utilities would need to charge on a per kilowatt basis for them to break even at the current consumption levels. And we see that under the mini grid, they would have to charge the lowest tariff of about 43 cents per kilowatt hour, while under the marginal cost MV allocation method, they would need to charge about 55 cents per kilowatt hour, and under the average, they would have to charge about 54 cents. But this is still a very high tariff, considering that at the moment, the utility in Kenya, especially for this low consuming set of customers, they charge only about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So this would be dramatic increases, which I'm not sure that this set of customers who live in basically low earning neighborhoods, which would actually afford. I don't think this is something that would be would make much financial or economic sense, or even social sense. So we moved a step further to examine what is the simple payback. Basically, like, we don't care about the interest or discount rate. We don't care about the time value of money, but how much would the customers need to use for the utility to break even under such circumstances, or how much would we need to charge? And we see that even under a 0% discount rate, the consumption levels and the tariff levels that utilities need to actually consider are still prohibitively high for this set of customers. And we did some sensitivity analysis around some parameters to look at how they would affect how, like, the percentage of the communities that would have to go or to be electrified through the grid, and also what the total savings, how the total or the lost potential savings would be affected. And we realized that increasing, we realized that the medium voltage infrastructure cost is actually the biggest contributor, or the biggest contributor towards the lost potential savings. Changing the medium voltage cost by 10% results in about a 4% increase or decrease in total lost potential savings. But however, on the grid share of communities, actually the mini grid cost is the most sort of the most influential parameter there. We see that increasing the decreasing the the mini grid cost by 10% actually under the marginal cost under the marginal MV cost allocation method and results in the grid share of communities reducing by about 8.5%. So basically about 8.5% of the communities that have been in grid grid zone or grid area, now they are flipped over to the mini grid space. And under the average MV allocation, about 4.7% are flipped over. But at the same time, increasing the mini grid cost by 10% has more effect under the average MV cost in that it would increase the percentage of communities that have to be grid extended by about 6.2%, while under the marginal MV cost allocation method, the increase is only about 2.33%. And we also ran a sensitivity around the discount rate. So basically, on the bottom x-axis, we have the nominal discount rate. On the at the upper x-axis, we have the real discount rate. So we assumed a constant or average inflation rate of about 6.7% over the last 12 years after the deep recession of 2008 or 2009, somewhere there. So we realized that with increasing discount rate, the amount of subsidy that is necessary both for grid extension and off-grid systems plateaus. Basically, like at a certain level of discount rate, there is no significant change in the amount of subsidy that is needed to provide electricity to these communities. However, we realized that increasing the discount rate actually ends up with a decrease in the fraction of communities that have to be grid connected. But even that difference is very little. So what are the policy implications of this? So we argue that by not taking a multimodal approach in extending electricity access to rural communities and instead doing so via grid extension, basically will always mean that utilities stand a chance to make huge losses. And we also realized that charging cost-reflective tariffs is not a viable option, as these communities are typically low-income areas, and also considering the fact that most utilities or governments actually consider electricity access as more of a social imperative than an economic or business So basically, electricity access is not viewed as a business, but it's more viewed as a social good. And we also argue that it is crucial for the utilities to consider geospatial distribution of subsidy for electricity planning. So basically, what we are saying here is the geospatial distribution of communities or customers that are about to be served needs to be taken into considerations when making decisions of what mode of electrification is needed in any community. And to reach a wider customer base, utilities have to move on from the sort of de facto grid-only expansion models to a larger portfolio of options, which includes mini grids and other off-grid systems like solar home systems. Yeah, this is the end of my presentation and what I've been working on for the past 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lefu. This is a wonderful presentation, and it's exciting to see all of your work and coming about. I see that we have a thank you in the Q&A for the presentation. Are there any questions for Lefu? Give it a minute here. You can, oh, I see it. Didn't enable talking. You can raise your hand too. You can put something into the question and answer section or into the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and unmute. Lefu, let me ask you, where do you hope to take this from here, or in terms of sharing these results in directly for to put some, if there's opportunities to put anything into action, or publications to share the information?
Yeah, we submitted a paper early March. It's still under review, so hopefully we get a positive feedback from the journal. But I am extending the study to other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. My next study country is Rwanda, and in the next iteration of this work, I am actually trying to develop a tool which can be used by any utility in the world to actually try to help them in their decision-making processes or thinking.
That's great. That's really exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What type of program would you be using to develop the tool? Is it a GIS? I know you were mentioning the.
So it's I'm developing the tool in Python, and what the tool is going to do is to take the current state of electrification in the country, basically the grid extent, and then pull together energy resources, and then try to map out for the currently unconnected communities or customers, and then help, like, say, make recommendations as to which what electrification mode would be best for which community. It's
Great.
it's a little, there's a lot of similarities and crossovers with Onset. It's just that I have a few reservations about some of the assumptions that they make in Onset. Yeah, so I'm trying to do something a little bit different.
That's great. That's really exciting. Yeah. We do have one question. On slide 27, you were able to look into why the mini grid costs were highly sensitive. Did you do any cost breakdown for this alternative in terms of equipment, maintenance, or fuel costs?
It's mostly the cost of storage. storage is very expensive, and it needs to be the replacement period. It can be very, very, very small, like down to 5 years. And I think if we can find a way of lowering the cost of storage for decentralized systems, then that would be a breakthrough in electricity access.
Thank you. I was really interested in the very beginning of your presentation, the chart that you showed where access is actually decreasing in Africa. What other actions do you think could be taken to help to address
this
exactly this access issue? I know that's a big question.
It's a big question, but I think mainly one of the key barriers, except the finance barrier, is the policy issue. So if the governments in sub-Saharan Africa could soften up a little bit or become a bit more flexible, I think we can see more mini-grid developers actually coming into the space and actually accelerating the electricity access. I worked for a mini-grid developer for a year in Lesotho, and I know that we had a lot of problems in terms of regulation, in a sense that there was basically no regulation. So anything we wanted to do, we'd always come across these hurdles where there was actually no policy or regulation surrounding that, and then we would have to find ourselves trying to recommend to the regulator in the country as to how they should go about allowing us to do business. And I think that is applicable in most sub-Saharan African countries.
Interesting also from yesterday's presentation and with Mary in terms of the importance of community collaboration of institutions, public and private. Yeah. Any other questions for Lefu? Well, Lefu, thank you so much and for your presentation, and once again, thank you to Mary for both of the presentations today. We're really excited to be hosting this all week, and this I will be emailing out everybody because all of these presentations will be available. The recordings will be available on our website here shortly. So thank you to everybody. Have a wonderful day and hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you.